Welcome to the Mystery and History channel. Be sure to subscribe and like so you don't miss out on more videos like this one. 56 days of non-stop siege with heavy equipment carried by hand through the mountains around Dien Bien Phu. That was how Vietnamese forces, led by General Von Nguyen Giap, defeated the bold gamble by the French colonial army to draw the enemy into a conventional battle between March and May 1954. The French garrison surrendered on May 7th, sealing the end of nearly a century of French colonial rule in Indochina. About 2,300 French service members were recorded as casualties during the fighting, while thousands of remaining personnel were sent to Vietnamese detention centers, where they faced very difficult conditions. The defeat led directly to the Geneva Conference, which would divide Vietnamese territory and, without anyone knowing it yet, plant the seeds of a much longer and more complex conflict over the next 2 decades. A line at the 17th parallel, meant to be temporary, became the effective border between 2 rival countries, and it was never erased. In July 1954, representatives of the powers involved in the Indochina conflict met at the Geneva Conference to negotiate the end of the French colonial war. The North would be controlled by Ho Chi Minh's communist government based in Hanoi, while the South would be run by a Western-backed government with its capital in Saigon. The agreements called for national elections in 1956 to reunify the country under one elected government, but that vote never happened. The Southern government, fearing a communist victory at the polls, refused to hold it, with quiet support from the United States. Historians consider this unresolved division the direct spark for 2 decades of armed conflict that would follow on Vietnamese territory. More than 98% of the vote, a number so high that the American embassy in Saigon privately admitted it was mathematically impossible. That was the official result of the referendum organized in October 1955 by Ngo Dinh Diem, Prime Minister of the United States, backed South Vietnamese government to remove former Emperor Bao Dai and become president of the newly created Republic of Vietnam amid strong signs of widespread fraud in several regions. Diem quickly consolidated power, favoring the country's Catholic minority in a mostly Buddhist territory, and harshly repressing any political opposition, including former allies of the independence movement. The United States, seeing him as a reliable anti-communist who could contain North Vietnam's advance, began sending growing financial and military support to the new South Vietnamese government. The seeds of popular discontent that would shake Diem's regime in the next decade had already been planted in the first months of his presidency. From a few hundred to more than 16,000 in just 2 years. That was how quietly the American military advisor presence grew in South Vietnam after President John F. Kennedy authorized the first large deployments in December 1961, officially to train local forces against the communist Viet Cong insurgency. Washington publicly insisted that the troops had no direct combat role, but in practice, American helicopters and advisors were already actively taking part in ground operations, including air support missions for South Vietnamese units. Photographs from the time show American advisors side by side with Vietnamese soldiers at forward bases, a quiet presence that grew month after month without meaningful public debate in the United States. This gradual involvement without a formal declaration of war would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire American escalation in Vietnam. 5 of the 15 American helicopters were put out of action within a few hours. A tactical setback that publicly exposed for the first time the gap between the optimistic reports from American command and what was really happening in operations. On January 2, 1963, in Dinh Tuong Province, about 320 Viet Cong guerrillas resisted an attack by South Vietnamese forces that were far larger in number: infantry, M113 armored vehicles, and an airborne battalion supported by American advisors. By the end of the day, 83 South Vietnamese service members and 3 Americans had been recorded as casualties, compared with 18 on the guerrilla side. General Paul Harkins, commander of the United States military mission, publicly insisted that the operation had been a success. Reporter Neil Sheehan walked through the area the next day and heard a frustrated American officer say a phrase that would become a symbol of the gap between the official message and reality. APBAC would become, for journalists and years later for the Pentagon itself, one of the first signs that events were not following the scenario described by Washington. Ngo Dien and his brother escaped through a secret tunnel when South Vietnamese generals, with advance knowledge from American officials, surrounded the presidential palace in Saigon on November 1, 1963. Captured the next day inside a Catholic church where they had taken refuge, Diem and Ngo Dinh Nhu, his main advisor, did not survive the later events, which took place inside an armored vehicle under circumstances that those involved never fully explained. Although the American government publicly denied any direct role in the change of power, documents released decades later show that American diplomats met with the generals involved and signaled support for Diem's removal. The end of his presidency plunged South Vietnam into an unstable series of military governments in the following months, just as the United States was considering increasing its direct involvement in the country even further. A second incident that probably never happened was enough to change the course of an entire war. On August 2, 1964, the American destroyer United States ship Maddox reported a clash with North Vietnamese boats in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin, a real episode, though small in scale. 2 days later, the crew reported a new event that later investigations, including documents declassified decades afterward, attributed to mistaken radar readings on a stormy night. Even so, President Lyndon Johnson brought the incident to the American Congress as early as August 5th, gaining near-unanimous approval of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave him broad powers to expand American involvement in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration. That resolution would become the legal basis used by the next 3 American presidents to expand United States involvement in Vietnam over the following decade. Flower garlands around their necks, signs reading, "Welcome Brave Marines." The landing of about 3,500 American Marines from the 9th Expeditionary Brigade on the beaches of Da Nang in central Vietnam on March 8, 1965, looked more like a festive welcome than the arrival of the first major United States ground forces in the conflict. The stated initial mission was strictly defensive, to protect the Da Nang Air Base, where many missions aimed at North Vietnam took off. Within a few months, however, the role of American troops would quickly expand into active operations across South Vietnamese territory. The contrast between the relaxed mood of that landing and the intense events that would follow over the next 10 years would make this photograph a symbol of the badly miscalculated early optimism of the American escalation. It was supposed to last only a few weeks. Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained air campaign against military and industrial facilities in North Vietnam, began on March 2, 1965, with the stated goal of forcing Hanoi to quickly abandon its support for Southern forces. But it would stretch for nearly 3 years, until the end of 1968, becoming one of the longest and most intense air campaigns conducted up to that point, with a huge amount of material dropped on North Vietnamese territory. Photographers and correspondents documented both American air bases in Thailand and on aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin, as well as the consequences of those operations in northern cities and villages, images that rarely reached the American public at the time. Despite the scale of the campaign, later military analyses showed that it had limited effect on North Vietnamese operational capacity, and the political cost ended up outweighing the strategic gains Washington had expected. Zippo lighters were used not only to light cigarettes, but also during actions meant to disable straw structures. Soldiers and journalists began calling these events Zippo operations, a practice used in some missions carried out in villages suspected of sheltering Viet Cong members throughout 1965. British photographer Larry Burrows, a Life magazine correspondent who had spent years in Vietnam, repeatedly documented these scenes, recording American soldiers damaging peasant homes in front of families watching their belongings disappear, even without clear evidence of guerrilla involvement. Burrows's images, regularly published in the United States, began showing the American public a side of the conflict far from the official story of liberation and protection of local populations. Burrows would continue covering events for more than 6 years until 1971, when his reporting was cut short during a helicopter journalism mission over Laos. A chrysanthemum in front of a line of soldiers. On October 21, 1967, tens of thousands of demonstrators marched to the Pentagon in Washington in one of the largest protests against the Vietnam War ever held in the United States. And amid high tension between protesters and National Guard members, French photographer Marc Riboud captured young activist Jean-Rose Casimir approaching the soldiers while holding a small flower, in a silent gesture that contrasted with the scene around her. The image, later known as the Flower Girl, became one of the most enduring visual symbols of the American peace movement, summing up in a single frame the contrast between the counterculture of the era and the state's military apparatus. The march ended without major incidents, but the steady growth of this kind of mobilization in the following years would become an increasingly difficult political factor to ignore. More than 100 cities were involved at the same time, during a holiday truce that was supposed to guarantee a few days of peace. That was how Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces launched the coordinated Tet Offensive in the early hours of January 30, 1968, even reaching the American Embassy compound in Saigon. Although American and South Vietnamese forces militarily retook almost every position within a few weeks, causing major losses to their opponents, the simple fact that the offensive had reached the heart of the capital contradicted months of optimistic statements from generals and the American government itself about the course of the war. Photographs and television reports showing intense fighting inside cities reached American living rooms in almost real time. After the Tet Offensive, public opinion polls in the United States recorded a sharp and lasting drop in popular support for continuing the conflict. General Nguyen Ngoc Loan, head of the South Vietnamese National Police, approached a captured Viet Cong member and carried out a decisive action in front of the lens of Associated Press photographer Eddie Adams, who was following troops through the streets of Saigon at the height of the Tet Offensive on February 1, 1968. Adams captured the exact moment of the episode, producing one of the most reproduced images of the entire war, able to compress into a single frame the tension and disorder of that period for millions of American viewers who saw it printed in newspapers the next day. The photograph would earn Adams the Pulitzer Prize the following year, but the photographer himself would spend the rest of his life troubled by the weight of the image, publicly arguing that it had been taken out of context and had unfairly damaged General Loan's reputation, without considering the circumstances of the events around it. Civilian residents of different ages were caught up in an operation carried out under the mistaken information that the village contained only enemy fighters, one of the most controversial episodes of the entire American military presence in Vietnam at My Lai on March 16, 1968. Army photographer Ronald Haberle, who was present during the Company C operation, recorded the scene with his personal camera, keeping the most sensitive images with him instead of turning them in with the official material. The American Army kept the episode internal for more than a year, until November 1969, when the Plain Dealer published Haberle's photographs along with a detailed account, causing the issue to gain national and international attention. The revelation led to formal investigations, limited disciplinary action, and a deep debate in the United States over the moral limits of how ground operations were conducted. 10 consecutive assaults, 10 days of tropical rain reducing visibility to almost zero, and 56 service members recorded as casualties for a position that would simply be abandoned weeks later. On May 10, 1969, paratroopers from the American 101st Airborne Division began an operation on the mountain known to the Vietnamese as Dong Ap Bia, listed on military maps only as Hill 937 in the A Shau Valley near the border with Laos. Journalists at the scene named the place Hamburger Hill in reference to the high number of casualties faced by American troops before the hill was finally taken on May 20th. News that a position won after such effort had been left behind because it had no real strategic value caused widespread outrage in the press and in the American Congress, fueling even more public skepticism about how the war was being conducted. The North Vietnamese government waited 2 days to announce the news, just so it would not coincide with the symbolic date of the country's independence. Ho Chi Minh, the historic leader of the Vietnamese independence movement and president of North Vietnam since the country's founding, died in Hanoi on September 2, 1969, at age 79, from heart complications worsened by the physical toll of decades of political and military struggle. The announcement came only on September 4th. Photographs of the state funeral in front of visibly moved crowds show one of the few moments of strong public emotion recorded in North Vietnam during the entire war. Many American analysts expected the leader's death to open the way for faster peace negotiations, but the collective leadership that took over the Workers' Party after his departure kept the same line of resistance until the country's reunification, achieved only 6 years later, without Ho Chi Minh witnessing the outcome of the war he had helped shape from the beginning. 13 people were affected in just a few seconds, and 4 students were recorded among the casualties of the episode that took place during a protest against the expansion of the war into Cambodia at Kent State University in Ohio, when the American National Guard reacted to the demonstration on May 4, 1970. Student photojournalist John Philo captured the instant when Marianne Vecchio, a 14-year-old teenager who did not even attend the university, knelt beside student Jeffrey Miller, reacting to what had just happened. The photograph, published on the covers of newspapers and magazines around the world, quickly became a symbol of the American state's forceful response toward its own young people protesting the war, feeding a wave of student strikes that shut down hundreds of universities across the country in the following weeks. Philo would receive the Pulitzer Prize for the image the next year. Successive American governments since the 1940s had repeatedly hidden from Congress and public opinion internal assessments, saying that military victory in Vietnam was becoming increasingly unlikely. That was what the so-called Pentagon Papers revealed when the New York Times began publishing them in June 1971, after they were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, an analyst who had worked directly on the secret study. President Richard Nixon's government tried to block publication in court, taking the case all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of press freedom within days. The revelation deepened public distrust of official information about the war even further, and confirmed with internal government documents what much of the photographic press had already been showing for years through images from the front. More than 120,000 soldiers, tanks, and heavy equipment crossing the border in a clear break from years of guerrilla operations. That was how the Easter Offensive began on March 30, 1972, launched by North Vietnam against a South Vietnam that was already operating with fewer American troops in direct participation, since President Nixon's Vietnamization policy had been gradually withdrawing American soldiers for 2 years. Photographs from the time show large columns of refugees leaving the most contested areas, especially near Quang Tri, where displaced families had to cross areas directly affected by the operations. Only with broad American air support did South Vietnamese forces manage, after months of intense operations, to contain the North Vietnamese advance before the end of that year, delaying the final outcome of the war by 3 years. 36,000 North Vietnamese soldiers, armored vehicles, and heavy equipment surrounded a city that almost no one outside Vietnam knew. Between April 7th and June 8th, 1972, An Loc, capital of Binh Long Province, about 62 miles from Saigon, withstood 66 days of non-stop siege during the Easter Offensive. Defended by South Vietnamese troops and a small group of American advisors, the city suffered extensive damage and accumulated disabled military vehicles, but remained under Southern control. Air support played a decisive role. B-52 aircraft, Cobra helicopters, and AC-130 aircraft were repeatedly used to contain enemy advances and provide support to those under siege. Among South Vietnam's elite forces, the 1st Airborne Brigade recorded 346 casualties and more than 1,000 members taken out of action. On the American side, 1 advisor was recorded among the casualties and 10 others were put out of action. 3 North Vietnamese divisions were severely weakened in the attempt to take the city. And Loc's resistance held back the advance toward Saigon, one of that year's least remembered turning points. More than 200 B-52 aircraft, hundreds of missions, 12 almost uninterrupted days. Only Christmas Eve brought a pause. Between December 18th and December 29th, 1972, the United States carried out Operation Linebacker II, an intense air campaign over Hanoi and the port of Haiphong, nicknamed the Christmas Bombing by the international press, with the stated goal of making the North Vietnamese government return to peace talks in Paris, which had stopped weeks earlier because of a diplomatic deadlock. Aerial photographs and images captured in Hanoi show considerable damage in residential and industrial areas after successive nights of operations, which also produced significant human impact according to North Vietnamese estimates, while 15 American aircraft did not return from the missions. The pressure had the effect Washington wanted. On December 29th, North Vietnam agreed to resume negotiations that, weeks later, would result in the final peace agreement. None of the parties agreed to withdraw their own troops already positioned inside South Vietnamese territory, only the foreign forces directly involved. It was this gap left open in the Vietnam Peace Agreement signed in Paris on January 27, 1973, by the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Provisional Revolutionary Government that would eventually prove fatal to its durability. Even with the immediate ceasefire, the withdrawal of the remaining American troops within 60 days, and the release of all prisoners of war specified in the text. Photographs of the ceremony show visibly cautious delegations. For the American government, the agreement represented an honorable exit from a conflict that had already been far too politically costly for years. For North Vietnam, it was only a tactical pause before resuming the final offensive for national reunification, which would happen a little more than 2 years later. 566 American military personnel and civilians, many of them pilots captured during missions over North Vietnamese territory and held for years at the facility ironically known as the Hanoi Hilton, left North Vietnamese custody between February and April 1973 as a direct part of the peace agreement signed in Paris, in a process named Operation Homecoming by the Pentagon. The Americans were flown on military aircraft to Clark Air Base in the Philippines for initial medical evaluation before their final return to the United States. Photographs and footage of the first men walking down the airplane stairs, many of them visibly emotional as they reunited with relatives they had not seen for years, were widely broadcast on American television and became one of the rare moments of genuine public celebration connected to the war. The release order prioritized those who had been held far from home the longest, some for more than 8 years before finally returning. Soldiers leaving their units and changing out of uniforms into civilian clothes, while hundreds of thousands of refugees tried to find space on any available ship or aircraft. That was the scene in Da Nang, South Vietnam's second largest city, when North Vietnamese forces broke through South Vietnamese defenses in the Central Highlands in March 1975 and quickly advanced toward the coast. Photographs from the time show enormous disorder at the city's airport and port, with people crowding onto overloaded vessels and members of local forces trying to push through the crowd to find a way out. The city came under North Vietnamese control without significant organized resistance on March 29, 1975, a change so fast and chaotic that it surprised even American military analysts, signaling that the end of South Vietnam was much closer than any official forecast admitted. For decades, everyone thought that was the roof of the American embassy. It was not. It was the Central Intelligence Agency building at number 22 Gia Long Street, photographed by Dutch photographer Hubert van Es from a window 4 blocks away on the afternoon of April 29, 1975, showing dozens of people climbing an improvised ladder to the roof to try to board a small helicopter during Operation Frequent Wind, the final evacuation of Americans and Vietnamese allies from Saigon. The image became the definitive symbol of the chaotic and rushed collapse of 2 decades of American presence in Vietnam. The next morning, April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks knocked down the gates of the Independence Palace in Saigon without resistance, officially ending the war. The city was renamed Ho Chi Minh in honor of the leader who did not live to witness that outcome, closing a chapter that had begun 20 years earlier with the same promise of a quick victory that never came true.